Hello, boys and girls. I'm very excited to be in the neighborhood today. We're here for story time. Instructor Chris asked me to come in and talk about the green pages in the ERG. Well, how do we use those green pages? Well, I like to tell a story. Let's tell a story about the dragon. We're here to fight the dragon. Today, it's a green dragon. Green dragon comes from the green pages. How do we get to the green pages in the ERG? Well, Firefighter Chris talked about the blue and the yellow and the orange. That was a very, very exciting story. I was so happy to hear it. But if we look at the blue pages, we have some green highlights. If we look at the yellow pages, we also have some more green highlights. Those tell you to go to the green pages. How do you remember that? Well, you know your primary colors. I know you do. Blue and yellow makes green. So when you see green, you go to the green pages. There's one exception. When your dragon is breathing fire, you want to stop at the orange pages. That's going to affect your initial isolation zone. That is something that we'll learn about later in the story, but if your dragon is breathing fire and smoke, you want to go to the orange pages to find your initial isolation zone, and then the green pages only if you need to know the downwind protective action distance for your smoke from your nasty dragon. I know a lot of people don't do this, but you won't remember everything Dr. Noel tells you today. So how do you get around that? Read the instructions. Just before the green pages, starting on page 286 in the 2020 version, begins the instructions for the green pages. There's some important information in there, some details like special circumstances when we use the green pages, if it's snowy out or if it's hot out, like how hot is hot, you ask? Well, 86 degrees Fahrenheit or 30 degrees Celsius for our international friends, that would be a hot day. Or if you're in a special circumstance, like surrounded closely by tall buildings or tall hills or mountains, you want to read the special attentions in the green pages. And you continue, and it talks about large spills and small spills. Again, that will come about later in our story. But what is large? What is small? Well, large is usually 55 gallons or bigger. That could be a small leak from a very big vessel, or it could be lots of small leaks from many, many, many small vessels. The important part is the total quantity. Is it bigger than a drum or smaller than a drum? Bigger is a large spill. There's also one more exception. If you're dealing with an intentional release of chemical warfare agent, those numbers change. It drops to about 4 pounds, roughly 4.4 pounds is the mark between large and small. So smaller than that is small, bigger than that is large. And the instructions go on to tell you about protective actions. What do those mean? Evacuation versus shelter in place. How do you make that decision? That's a very tough decision, but there's some guidelines in your instruction pages. And then at the beginning of the green parts on page 295, we have a picture. We have our initial isolation zone and our downwind protective action distance. What does that mean? Well, the initial isolation zone is where you could face a fatal exposure, especially if you're on the downwind side, or have other severe symptoms. The downwind protective action distance is for folks who may become incapacitated. If they're in that area, they may have trouble sheltering in place or performing an evacuation. And then what is in the green pages? Have you ever wondered, what makes the green dragon so nasty? Well, everything in the green pages is a TIH, toxic inhalation hazard, or PIH, poison inhalation hazard. They mean exactly the same thing. Some places like the P, some places like the T, but they mean exactly the same thing. So everything in these green pages is a TIH, or it's a material that reacts with water to form a TIH. What is a TIH? Well, it's something that can kill you in one lungful in the worst case scenario. What does that mean? So if you have no protective gear on whatsoever, and you take one lungful, so let's try that. Let's breathe with me. Go deep breath. That's enough to kill you in the worst case scenario. So you don't want to be near those things without proper protective equipment. So the green pages are broken into 3 tables: Table 1, Table 2, Table 3. And if we look at the first table on page 296, that's the beginning of Table 1, you see you need to figure out the answer to a couple questions. Is this a large spill or is this a small spill? Remember, we just talked about that, so you got that. I know you do. And then you have to figure out if it's daytime or nighttime. Like, do I reach for my phone and check the time or look at my watch to figure out if it's daytime or nighttime? No, let's keep it simple, boys and girls. Let's figure out where the sun is. Is the sun up? Then it's daytime. If the sun is gone, then it's nighttime. So we look at our Table 1, and we know the answer to those 2 questions, and we can find the right spot in the table. And you'll also notice these materials are listed by 4-digit ID number. Remember, firefighter Craig talked about the 4-digit ID number. That's the order things are listed in these green pages. Also note that at the beginning, there's a bunch of things without 4-digit ID numbers. That's a change in the 2020 version of the ERG. Those are chemical warfare agents. Who needs a 4-digit number? Who's going to ship these with those numbers? Nobody does. So that's why they took them away. So they're at the very beginning of the table in the 2020 version. And then everything else goes in normal order. So we talked about this picture on page 295. You'll get a better view from Mr. Cameraman. I know, Mr. Cameraman, you'll get that taken care of for me. I know you will. But remember, we have the circle and the square. The circle is your initial isolation zone, and the square is your downwind protective action distance. What is the initial isolation zone? That's the circle of death. You don't want to be in the circle of death without any protective equipment on. So that is very helpful to know how big that circle is, so you know where you need to wear the proper personal protective equipment. And again, that information on what to wear can come from your orange pages. And then your Table 1 information will give you some examples. Like I'm looking at page 322 for organic phosphorus compound poisonous flammable NOS. Guide 131 and 4-digit ID number 3279. Let's say we have a bunch of barrels. They're all leaking. That's a large spill. It's more than one barrel. And it's daytime. So this is going to say our initial isolation distance is 600 feet or 200 meters for our international friends. Remember, that's the radius of your circle of death. And then the downwind protective action distance for daytime is 1.5 miles or 2.4 kilometers for our international friends. And that will help you make these decisions. Where do I need to stay away from as a first responder? And then where are the portions where people may get into trouble performing evacuations or shelter in place? You know, how do you put that on a map? Well, there's an app for that. The ERG has an iPhone and Android friendly app. It's freely downloadable. That lets you take that picture that we talked about and put it right on a map on your phone, and then you can move it to wherever you need to make it easy. It will even ask you about wind direction and wind speed, so you'll get the best possible answer for your initial data that goes on a map. So I said there's 3 tables in the green pages. Table 1, Table 2, Table 3. Yes, I know you can count 1, 2, 3. That's very good, boys and girls. What is Table 2 for? Table 2 is for water reactive materials. So here's a picture. I'm sure Mr. Cameraman will show us a better picture later. That simply tells you the toxic inhalation gas that is produced. Now, keep in mind, some water reactive materials will produce flammable gases. Those are not in the green pages. The green dragon doesn't care so much about fire. It only has the toxic or poison gases, and it'll tell you what it is. Like page 347, I'm looking at ID 1777, which is guide 137, and fluorosulfonic acid that produces HF. It's hydrogen fluoride. If you forget what HF means, the bottom tells you. That's maybe not so important for very first responders. It's later responders who come with fancy test equipment or who have the proper test papers can look at this information and go, oh, I know what meter to use, or I know what test papers will respond to this material, so I can test to see how far material has spread. And then there's one more table, Table 3. That's nice for some commonly spilled materials. There's 6 materials that can be spilled most commonly, such as ammonia, and there's a few others. And Table 3 has some extra questions to ask you about wind conditions and container types, like a small container versus a rail car versus a truck. And it will give more refined answers to those same initial isolation zones and downwind protective action distances. And that is good to know, makes life a little bit easier. Well, boys and girls, thank you for story time with ERG. That was a lot of fun. Very exciting to be here in the neighborhood. Thank you for Instructor Chris for inviting me over. Now he's going to come back and tell you more about the white pages at the end of the book. Thank you for your time.